The Raising the Bar podcast, brought to you by the Association of Gray's Inn Students.
Hello and welcome to the Raising the Bar podcast. I am Nia Marshall and today we are lucky to be joined by Alex Friede, who is a director at the Philip Friede & Co. Alex is an accountant who advises self-employed professionals and small businesses on their tax, accountancy and financial management affairs. He's a specialist in the affairs of barristers and his portfolio currently includes over 200 practitioners. Today we will be speaking about managing finances as a barrister. Welcome and thank you for joining, Alex.
Well, it's very good to be here.
Now, this is very much a hot topic only because many students or aspiring barristers don't get to hear a lot about this before entering practice. So before we delve into the substantive matter today, we just would like to ask you a bit about your educational background. So can you shed some light on that for us today, Alex?
Well, I have a reasonably unconventional background in my profession in that I originally trained to be a barrister. So in 2010, I did the bar course, having done a law conversion course previously, got all the way to sort of being offered pupillage. And in that intervening period between the BPTC and starting, I was sort of propositioned by my father, who was himself looking to move on, retire his own practice, Philip Friede & Co. And I made the switch almost 10 years ago now.
Definitely unconventional indeed. So, I must ask the question, Alex. Although you were offered pupillage, as you just stated, why did you decide to pursue a career in accountancy then?
Yeah, so my dad worked with barristers for many years. I should say I was very unsuccessful at leveraging any sort of potential nepotism. We were very poor at getting any further because of his contacts. But I did do a mini pupillage in about 2005, and that was general crime, and I was sort of hooked from that point. By the time I got to actually, being offered pupillage, the chambers that I had been offered ceased to exist in the intervening period, and it was a time when lots of people were sort of quite worried about publicly funded practices. And like I said, for different reasons, our own family, it made a lot of sense for me to join the family business.
Okay, that makes sense a lot. And it also puts you in a unique position as well because you've been trained to become a barrister. So it makes you quite unique as well to kind of understand or finances and makes you in a great position to be a specialist in that particular area. So let's talk about pupils financial management as we're going to work through the career as a barrister slowly. So let's start there. Can you provide essential financial tips or so that all pupil barristers should be made aware?
I think when it comes to tax and general financial matters for barristers, it's not the most complex area. There are some very important but quite sort of easy to understand principles. And I think it's more about A, knowing what those principles are, and B, habit building. So it's easy for people to know what they should be doing, but it's hard for people to actually put them into practice. And as a pupil, there are some key principles, I think, to understand. The first one being the relevant dates. So unless you've been told, okay, when is my first tax payment? When do I need to file tax returns? When do I register for VAT? All of these sort of, pretty boring logistical points. How will you know when you need to address them? So understanding your key dates and deadlines is really important. Secondly, I think you need to have an awareness of just how the nuts and bolts of tax and potentially VAT, if you're going to be VAT registered, just a real top line understanding of how it works and what is my tax bill going to be based on? What are the headline tax rates? How am I going to be paying income tax, national insurance, student loan, VAT? And then from that, the next thing is, well, how do I sort of keep track of everything? Because it's one thing to know, okay, this is how my tax bill is going to be calculated. But the follow on is, well, how does one prepare and file a tax return? And when you boil it down, I think the most important thing is that people are keeping proper records of all of their financial transactions. I think everything else, that there are nuances involved in your tax affairs and such, it really comes down to that core requirement to keep track of all of your financial transactions. I think we'll probably talk about some of these in a bit more detail, but either, and it's probably an either or, separate accounts for work and personal. So you can compartmentalize your work transactions from your personal life, and also a really basic system for keeping track of your expenses. So we use with most of our clients, particularly the younger ones, particularly the pupils, an app that they can use every time they buy something for work. They keep track of it, and it's a way for them to manage their own expenses.
Now, what seems to have jumped out to me is knowing the particular dates for taxes. So at which stage are pupils' earnings then subject to taxes?
In almost all cases, you are going to be, and I'm really talking here about self-employed barristers. I think if you're an employed barrister, you're in a much better system. You got PAYE, you've probably got a payroll department and a finance team that are dealing with all of this. But for a self-employed barrister, in almost all cases, self-employment starts first day of second six. That's when you register with HMRC as being self-employed, and that's when all of your profits relating to self-employment begins. And I think in almost every chambers that I'm aware of, that's the second six award being taxable, and then your own income and expenses that you're deriving through your own practice.
Now, we do know that there are some chambers that allow for pupils, before they start pupillage, basically, to draw down on their awards. So how are advances or drawdowns of pupillage awards treated? Can they be taxed?
Yeah, the important thing on this area to note is that there's no statute, there's no case law. There really is just an arrangement, quite a long-standing arrangement between the Bar Council and HMRC about how they will tax pupillage awards. So some of the nuances, I will be completely honest, are judgment calls, simply because we really don't have anything else that we need to go on. Ultimately, the question is it a first six award or is it a second six award? The first six award is, in like I said, in most cases, treated as being non-taxable. It's kind of like a scholarship or a vocational award. It's not when self-employment starts. You can form your own views as to whether first six pupils are in fact self-employed, but for these purposes, they're not treated as that. And the second six is when self-employment starts. So if your arrangement with chambers specifies that the drawdown is a drawdown of first six, then sure, it can be treated as a first six award and it's not taxable. If it's defined as being a drawdown of the second six award, then my view would be, well, it doesn't really matter when you take it. It's a second six award. It's pursuant to self-employment. It goes into the accounts just like anything else. Now, most chambers either specify it's a first six drawdown or they're silent to it. And I think if they're silent to it, I assume, well, it was drawn down before second six, quite a long time before, in fact. So I'm kind of going to assume that it's a first six award.
That's very helpful. Now, let's turn to barristers financial management. So we've passed the pupillage stage, and we're now speaking about juniors primarily. What kind of financial advice do you provide to barristers at this stage, basically?
Well, I'm regulated to give tax advice, and obviously there's some generic financial advice that I can give, but financial specialist financial advice is a regulated activity. So I don't get involved in investment advice or anything like that. I think generic financial advice is probably what a lot of young barristers benefit from. And actually, I think, to be honest, when it comes to my role and what I see in practice every day, I think it's just being in control of your finances. Whoever you are, I think in almost every case, all of my barrister clients, I think, have to deal with a lot of the same issues. So, the first one is going to be a structural one, which is having to perform work, incur costs, and then have to wait to get paid. And there are different, obviously massive diversity of different practices. Some will have smaller debtors than others. But I think almost every barrister deals with this idea that, okay, they've got to have some discipline because they know they're going to have to wait to get paid. So you can't really have these fine margins with your finances. I think you've always got to have a kind of window, a margin of safety, because you're often waiting to get paid for work. And I think secondly, it's quite difficult for barristers to know what their financial position is looking like. When you're doing multiple cases for multiple people, it's not like a salary where you know how much you're being paid every month or every year, and you can sort of budget against that. Because all self-employed work is often quite uncertain, really keeping track of, okay, my payment summary, my work done report, my expenses, I think is really important for people to understand, what is my profit? How much can I budget for outside of my work?
Now, earlier in our conversation, you spoke about a savvy app that you can give to pupils. This prompted me to think about, how can barristers or utilize any software to ensure that they're keeping accurate and up-to-date records of their income and expenditure? Are there a lot of those on the market, would you say?
There are quite a lot on the market. There are not that many that I think there's certainly none that are specifically designed for barristers. And there are a couple that I think are probably not particularly good for barristers. Most barristers will probably be familiar, even if it's something that they don't use, with a software called Xero. And Xero is a really, really interesting accounting software product for small businesses. I think for most barristers, Xero is probably a little bit too much. I think it requires a lot of a lay person to get it to work, but it can do really well for lots of barristers, and lots of chambers are also quite adept with it. So they've got quite a lot of institutional knowledge there. But what we use with our clients is an expense scanning app called Dext. It used to be called Receipt Bank, but it's exactly the same software. And it's really the market leader for small businesses when it comes to expense scanning apps. So you get a receipt, you take a picture, you also can use it in your web browser, and there's all sorts of different ways to do it. And I don't think anybody really who works with barristers, we're not the early adopters of this technology. It's a pretty mature market. So accountants have been using this with various industries for a number of years. And there are all sorts of government regulatory plans to digitalize the tax system, and these sort of apps are front and center.
It's mind blowing how we use technology to assist us. That's great because I'm sure that it would have been easing a lot of burden and saving the trees in terms of paperwork. Now,
Yeah.
which business expenses can be claimed to be offset against income?
Yeah. So the statute really is just that an expense must be wholly and exclusively for the purposes of work, and everything sort of flows from that. So all the principles, all the case law, everything we understand about allowable expenses flows from wholly and exclusively. For most of a barrister's accounts, I don't think there is a conceptual difficulty with whether it should be part of the accounts or not. So, you're not gonna pay money for indemnity insurance or your practicing certificates or a wig and a gown or a collarette or any of these sort of things unless they're wholly and exclusively for work. So there's some real specific areas, items of expenditure that are just obviously allowable. Then there are the sort of generic professional expenses that you'd expect almost anybody in business to be able to claim, like your office setup costs, computers, mobile phones, consumables, stationery, postage, and that sort of thing. Obviously, chambers rent and expenses is by far the biggest category of expense that a barrister will incur. And I would say that the two areas that are kind of conceptually the most tricky to wrap your head around will be use of home. Actually, it's not very tricky when you deal with it, but I think from the outside it feels like it. Every barrister now, I assume, is working from home to some degree. 99% of my clients will be doing that. Proportion of your home running expenses should be accounted for in your accounts. There are different approaches. Best one is normally to use proportion of floor space method. And then the other category that I think not in the last 12 months, but in general causes the most amount of debate is travel expenses. And travel expenses for all self-employed people is a bit of a live issue amongst before the courts. But broadly speaking, any work travel that isn't a commute, so something that's regular and predictable, is a allowable expense, should go into the accounts, should be eligible for tax relief. And that's going to courts, meetings, lectures, anything for work. In the sort of traditional sense, chambers would normally be a commute. Whether or not that will be the case in the future with remote ways of working remains to be seen. And a lot of my job is when it comes down to preparing sets of accounts is to advise on, okay, well, which travel is allowable and which isn't.
That's interesting. It's also apparent that expenses will always be ongoing once you're working. But as you stated before, with self employed barristers, the income may be a bit uncertain in terms of you may not be able to predict specifically a certain amount monthly. What advice would you give to junior barristers about strategically managing the earnings that they do gain?
It's a really difficult issue to advise on. Like I said, I think the best thing to do is to almost create your own PAYE system. So the reality is that because you don't have much control over when you'll be paid, you're going to have some big months and some low months in terms of the money that you're paid. Your billings are not going to resemble your bank balance at any given time often. So it's important to sort of make sure that when you are paid, you squirrel away enough money for tax and VAT, and almost always it's appropriate to arrive at a percentage. I'm not going to give you that percentage because it's not possible for me to say from the outside to everybody what that percentage should be, but everybody will have their own percentage that's relevant for them. Then what I really like is sort of paying yourself a salary or a stipend or Or even you can do it in reverse. You can sort of say, well, okay, every month I'm going to look at what I've been paid. I'm going to put aside my tax money. I'm going to pay myself my salary. That's for my living costs. That's what I need to survive. Or vice versa, I'm just going to put aside some business savings, that I'm going to hold on. In the good months, you draw down on the surplus. In the bad months, you eat into it. Now, obviously, this is all great if you need to. Ultimately, if you need to dip into your tax savings for your running costs, then you do so. But at least you do so consciously here, knowing that you can catch up in the future.
I think that's good advice. And given that tax seems to be this recurrent factor that we have to keep in mind, which taxes apply to self-employed barristers?
So income tax, national insurance, and your student loan repayments will all be paid to HMRC. It won't be hypothecated. So, it may be hypothecated somewhere down the line, but for you just pay one amount to HMRC. Taxpayers in this country pay tax 31st of January, 31st of July. So you pay twice a year. And then not all barristers, but many barristers will be VAT registered at some point. And VAT, which is not necessarily a tax on, it's a consumption tax rather than a tax on your profits. You're sort of collecting it rather than suffering it. But that's paid every quarter, so every 3 months, and everyone's got their own quarterly cycle.
Given that everyone has their own quarterly cycle, I think persons would be able to predict when those payments are due, and it seems as though you'd be able to put away for that time or save for that time. Given that we recognize that there is some uncertainty about when you'd be specifically gaining or receiving your earnings, what strategies do you think barristers can employ to ensure that they combat any challenges of financial planning?
One of the hard things I've observed from the outside looking in is that it's a very hard way to make a living. It's not easy, particularly at the beginning, and it's quite a hard profession to get a foothold into. So you don't have the luxury of, like, an accountancy trainee normally gets a couple of years while they're training, and sort of an apprenticeship in their practice where they're kind of given a bit of a, they're sort of treated with a bit of caution. We don't throw them into the fire straight away. It seems to me at the bar, it's a bit more sink or swim. Certainly when you start second six, and it's a tough job, and also you're running a business alongside that. So, I think in the first year or so, many people give themselves quite a hard time about their own financial planning, and really this is often a long-term profession, and it just getting through the first year or so is actually, that's not something to be ignored. When you've maybe a year or so down the line, and you've got a better sense about your practice and about the rhythms of your practice and where you want it to go, I think that's probably where it's time to start doing a bit more planning. And it doesn't have to be anything that's particularly complex. I think, well, there are kind of two things that most people have as their priority. Often it's paying off a student loan if they've got one, and secondly, it's getting on a housing market. Now, that's probably biased for where I live in London, where the housing market is, I think, different from elsewhere. But I think most people, that's the goal at the beginning, and it's a very simple and popular goal.
I think that would definitely be helpful for our listeners. I'm thinking about the fact that barristers will be practicing while running a business, as you said. And what pops to mind is cash flow problems. How can you manage or combat any potential cash flow issues within your business while doing all of these things?
I'm sure that at a chambers level, there are things that can be done to improve cash flow. Now I must admit, I don't know what they are, but I do think that I do think that certainly my experiences working with chambers themselves and fees clerks that I've come across in my time, I'm sure that many people would benefit from having conversations with chambers about ways to get paid more quickly. Because whatever I say about cash flow, the best way to improve your cash flow is for your invoices to get paid quickly. In terms of my world, the only thing, which is quite a big one, is to take advantage of something called the cash basis. So the cash basis is where your accounts and your income tax, national insurance, student loan liability is based on money in, money out. So you're not paying tax on your age debt. You're making sure that all of your tax bills are based on your payments. And, if you are submitting invoices and getting paid in arrears, that must mean that your tax bills are being paid as slowly as possible, which obviously is good for cash flow. And also, I think for many people, it just kind of simplifies things to some degree. Cash base is only available for certain people. So to get into the cash basis, you need to have turnover under 150,000 per annum. So, most pupils will get in, and you don't have to come out until you exceed 300,000, double the entry threshold. So, it is, I would say, it is a no-brainer, very, very standard tax planning tool.
Yeah, it seems very effective from how you are describing it. Now, another thing that pops to mind is how can barristers go about managing their incurred costs, like paying chambers a percentage of their earnings, while still saving and contributing towards investments like mortgages and pension plans?
Well, I suppose it's quite difficult actually to answer that question. What needs to happen is an awareness of, okay, what is my budget? Because there's no point, maybe there is, but in my view, there's no point making chunky pension contributions if it means that you don't have enough to service your living costs. So, you need to be in control of all this information. And I think, like I said, I think the most important thing is to try and live. And this is not for, a pupil. I don't think it's fair for me to say a pupil should live within their means, because it's often quite hard to build up the capital that, is that you would need. But certainly as time goes on and finances become more stable, and it's important to have that margin of safety. And the reality is that, we're human, and we've sort of got to build these habits that protect ourselves from our human tendencies. So, when I get paid a big brief fee, I need to know that, okay, I need to keep back some of that for tax, and I need to be, I need to have the discipline to add to my savings and such like.
It seems as though discipline is the key to manage your business or manage your aspect of your practice.
Yeah, I think, sorry to cut you off, but I think that discipline is potentially I think it's a bit unfair because, I would say most people who are barristers that, I know I use the word discipline, so it's my own fault, but most barristers I know that, let's face it, don't have the best financial affairs. They have plenty of discipline in their lives, and often the problem is that they're putting themselves last. They might be putting their clients and their family before themselves. And when I say discipline, I think it's more like I said, building these habits and just keeping on track of things, keeping on track of your own financial position. And it's not that hard, but it's sort of like exercise. If you do it a lot, it compounds. If you don't do it for a long time, it gets quite painful when you get around to it.
Now that makes sense, and especially when you refer to some barristers that unfortunately put themselves last, it also makes me wonder how would they exactly prepare for ill health? So, for example, how can barristers then prepare for a period of loss of earnings through ill health?
Well, there's really only two ways. One is to have your own private savings. So, a rainy day fund. I think we've, not just barristers, but I think everybody has, seen in the last year or so how important it is to have cash on hand in case, unforeseen events occur. But you can also insure against these sort of things. So you can have critical illness insurance policies, and not that many, but I know some chambers will have group policies, which, when it comes to things like insurance products, typically it's best to be part of a group and you can negotiate better. So I would say, it should be on the radar. I don't advise on insurance products because, again, it's a regulated activity. But I think in generic terms, it's a good thing to have on one's radar to be thinking about critical illness insurance and, at some point, life insurance, which is quite similar.
That seems very helpful. Now, I know earlier in our conversation you were saying that there were some main differences between the employed bar and the self-employed bar regarding financial management or assisting with taxes specifically. Are there any other major headlines that our listeners should know about?
I must say, that our firm, we act for over 500 self-employed barristers. I don't act for a single employed barrister, or not knowingly. Maybe I do. Maybe I do, but they're sort of they've gone into something else. But there's not really much that an employed barrister would need in terms of their own taxation or investment planning that anyone else who was employed would need to think about. So, like I said, all the complexity of paying tax, keeping your own control of your own finances, that they are taken out of your hand when you are employed. You have a payroll department and a finance team. So I imagine if there is anybody who is at the employed bar who has made it this far, there's not really very much I can say that they're going to find useful.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I have one more question for you, and that's simple. Do you think that barristers should consider hiring a financial advisor or an accountant to combat these challenges?
Okay, financial advisor, I think often, well, it's case by case, right? Because you might have some reasons outside of your bar practice why you'd want financial advice. In general, I think certainly at the beginning, a financial advisor is not going to be cost effective. And every financial advisor that I know, and I know quite a lot of them, will say the same thing, that you often need to have a level of capital where it makes sense to instruct someone. For an accountant, can a barrister do their own accounts, tax return? Yeah, definitely. And I've met some barristers who have done a very good job. It's a bit of a rarity, I think, to find a barrister that does their own accounts and tax return well. I think the issue when it comes to these sort of things is that you don't really know what you don't know. So it's my job to keep up to date with regulatory changes, tax changes, industry best practices. I think it's going to be quite hard for somebody to sort of do that as an amateur on the weekend. And, I think, to be honest, as one's practice develops, it's sort of outsourcing. You can do a lot of this stuff yourself, but you got to consider the time and the effort and the emotional baggage of having to do all of this on your own. So obviously, this is what I do for a living. So I would say that people should consider hiring an accountant. But yeah, I do think that there's a real need for it. There are different accountants, and that not everyone works in the same way. So it's what's most important is that you work with somebody that you trust, and also somebody who provides the service that you want, because it's not a one size fits all sort of thing. There are different people doing different things.
Well, that's very helpful, Alex. I quite enjoy this conversation on managing finances. So thank you for spending a little time chatting with us today.
Well, look, thank you for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to talk to you today.
Thanks for listening to the Raising the Bar podcast. Please subscribe, rate and review. And for more information, check us out on Twitter at RaisingTheBarGI.